Okay, welcome everybody to a video on food resources. This is chapter 13 out of the 6th edition of Living in the Environment. That's the textbook we use in our AP Environmental Science class. And this chapter is on food resources. So let's get it started here. Food in the world. Here's some statistics. This textbook is actually a bit old, so these might not be exactly accurate today. But this is what's in the book, and this is what's on the test. So here we go. There's 30,000 different plant species that people can eat and are actually edible. Not going to kill us or anything. 15 of those plants and 8 different animals actually supply 90% of the food that everybody eats. So if you think about it, there's not a lot of people eating kale or something. That's not a main part of our diet or whatever, depending on if you're vegan or something. But wheat, rice, and corn are some of those 15 plants, and they actually account for half of all the calories that people eat over time, I guess. Wheat, rice, and corn actually account for half of the calories that all people eat, with 66% of people eating mainly rice, wheat, and corn, or really the grains, if you want to call it. The top third of the economic producers in the world, especially a lot of Northern European countries and the U.S., eat mostly meat. Reason being for that is because meat is actually extremely expensive and inefficient to produce. We'll get more into that later into the video here. Let's take a look at a map of some different types of agriculture that's practiced around the world. So you'll see in the northern hemisphere and a lot of the industrialized countries, we practice industrialized agriculture, meaning using large scale, large commercial farms, using a lot of energy and water and stuff like that. That'll come in a minute. But then you see some of the less developed and poor countries, a lot, especially in the southern hemisphere, practice a lot of shifting cultivation, kind of like slash and burn type stuff. So, well, I mean, not that extreme everywhere, but they'll use a piece of land until it's depleted and move to the next piece of land. Grow, whatever they need to, not really concerned for the nutrients contained within the soil or any of that type of stuff. And then there's some nomadic herding going on here, and this is the Saharan area, and then Western Asia. So types of food production. There's industrialized agriculture, and then there's traditional type agriculture. As I just said, industrialized agriculture uses very large amounts of energy, fossil fuels, and water. This agriculture actually is by far the main user of water in developed countries. But industrialized agriculture uses, let's turn on a laser here, get a little bit fancy. Oh, look at that. Okay. So we have a laser now. Anyways, commercial fertilizers are preferred in industrial applications because, one, they're faster acting as compared to organic fertilizers, including animal manure and compost and stuff like that. Some organic farmers will still use compost just because, you can take a lot of waste out of landfills and stuff like that, and it's really nutrient rich, but it takes a lot longer to actually begin to work in the soil. So commercial fertilizers are produced in very specific like ratios, there's like 30, 40, 50 or whatever, and each one number means like the amount of potassium. Another one is the nitrogen and stuff like that. Here's my dog. His name is Kirby. So anyways, but these large commercial farms use a ton of land, and they usually, the larger commercial ones will specify, they'll have a specific crop or animal that they cultivate, or what's the word for animals? Anyway, cultivate on the land, meaning they can focus on one thing, and they do that very well and much more efficient than a traditional agricultural form of farming, which is actually practiced by 2.7, I should say, billion people on Earth. You'll see in a lot of less developed countries, the traditional agriculture comes into play because there's not as many commercial farms there. So you and your family will have not just like a garden like you have maybe at your house, but like more of a, very small farm, and they live off of that. A lot of their food comes from that. They might have some animals. They might have goats or cows for milk, or chickens included. Usually, you're not going to sell what you make because you're just kind of making enough to stay alive as subsistence farming. But then there's traditional agriculture that involves, it's like very intensive agriculture, and it's not very efficient, and so it requires a lot of human labor and a lot more work and resources put into an area, and it brings in less of a yield relative to what you could do with more industrialized, modern practices of farming. A lot of these industrialized practices came about in the late 50s, early to mid 1960s, during something called the Green Revolution. And it's really just a movement, or really a lot of research and technology initiatives came about in this time, looking to increase agricultural production, not just, in certain areas, but worldwide, to kind of work on solving a growing hunger problem due to the rapid increase in the population during the industrial era, but particularly in developing countries who had access to machinery and things like that. They were looking to increase yields by using new types of crop, let's just say cultivators, large scale machines and stuff like that, mechanization, using controlled irrigation, so not just using like ditches and stuff properly placed to saturate the soil, but more mechanized systems of irrigation. Have you ever drive past a farm and see those massive sprinklers that put out like hundreds of gallons a minute over a farm? That began to came around during the Green Revolution. Commercial fertilizers, artificial fertilizers, not just organic stuff like manure and composting and stuff like that, but actual lab created fertilizers designed to do a very specific thing, a very specific way. Pesticides, this is a pretty controversial thing. Most of the pesticides that came about during this time period are illegal, at least in the U.S. now, because it was realized that they had a pretty significant impact, not just on killing the pests on the farm, but all over the place. Danger to people, danger to the rest of the environment. Even making whole species go extinct, not just pests, but larger, higher up the food chain animals that are affected by the effects of biomagnification and stuff like that comes along with introducing chemicals like this into the environment. and then mechanization. Um, the results of the Green Revolution, it didn't eliminate famine, especially worldwide. The developed countries weren't really plagued by famine, but it definitely helped to do that. Some of the reasons that it didn't um, eliminate famine is just it's less developed countries have, especially those that are struggling with food and stuff. It's more of a distribution problem than it is actually growing food. I think that there's a statistic somewhere that says that with all the food that we grow across the world, we could easily feed everybody that lives here. But wealthier countries waste a lot of their food. And there's a number later in this PowerPoint that we'll get to. The population is not leveling off. It's still rapidly increasing, increasing exponentially. So we're going to constantly have to grow more food in less space because people are taking up space with living and commercial things like shopping and offices and stuff like that. Production costs are increasing. There's a lot of different ways that go into. I'm not going to ramble on about that. Due to the having to find new ways to feed the growing amount of people, some of the production methods are having more and more of a negative impact on the environment. The pesticides and herbicides and genetically modified crops are all kind of working together, and it's making kind of it's a problem. It's a problem. And then it didn't work for everyone. That goes with the famine thing. And there's kind of three major steps that were taken during the Green Revolution to try to put these methods into use. The first one is developing and planting monocultures of selectively bred or genetically engineered high yield varieties of key crops. So stuff like corn, soybeans, even almonds and stuff like that. The genetically modified, the genetic industry, people figured out how to design crops to do more specific things like, okay, this crop can now be grown in a place where there's less water, or this crop can now be sprayed with Roundup and it'll only affect the weeds that are around it, not the actual crop. But then, planting these very specific genetically modified crops with a low biodiversity and taking that plant and planting it on a very, very large scale. So not growing anything else, not putting little trees all over the place. You're not growing corn and soybeans at the same time. You're not growing lettuce or whatever else you grow at the same time. You're growing one crop in one area on a very large scale that allows you to increase efficiency. But large scale monoculture cultivation can be harming the environment in its own way, just because a lot of the animals and stuff and all the animals lived in those habitats that were once taken up by natural area now have a specific crop that they may or may not have had before. So that has its own batch of problems. Lavishing fertilizers, pesticides, and water on crops to produce high yields. So with the more and more food that you need to grow, you need more and more water, obviously, and more fertilizer and more plant food for the plants to eat themselves. Not eat, but whatever. The pesticides, with the growing amount of area you have to cover with the crops. These crops go faster, they grow larger, and it increases the intensity of how they're grown, because you can grow, if you want to keep your soil in a fairly good condition, even with fertilizers, you're going to need to go on a crop rotation cycle, which, there's like 3 or 4 different crops that you plant. You plant this at this time, you harvest it, you wait a while, you plant this different plant, which can survive off of the nutrients that were left over from the previous plant, and then reintroduce its nutrients to the next one, and then so on, so on, so on, so on. That'll allow you to get allow you to keep your soil in good condition and produce a higher yield in a faster amount of time. So there's benefits to this, and then there's also some downsides, some costs, if you will. Between 1900 and 2000, the cultivated area, the area that's used for farming, increased by 33%, while energy inputs into that increase in farming increased 80 times. So not 80%, but whatever 80 times, so 8,000% or something like that. So positive effects. It did reduce pressure to convert natural land to cropland, because you can now grow more food in a smaller area more efficiently. And it did prevent some deforestation and habitat conversion by using less space. But some negative effects, though, the pollution coming from all the mechanical aspects of it, and from using pesticides and all sorts of chemicals in all the plants, but also reduced biodiversity by genetically modifying crops and practicing like monoculture cultivation. You're basically having one very specific genetic sequence across a lot of plants, makes it susceptible to a disease. So if you have a disease that affects one of the plants, it's going to very, very easily spread throughout all of them because they're so similar. But soil quality is also a problem with this, because you've got such an intense agricultural thing going on here. Your soil is just getting beat, and they're not using as much organic fertilizers, which kind of help build up the soil and more natural nutrients, rather than artificially putting phosphorus and nitrogen and stuff into the soil. So some techniques for producing food in the Green Revolution. So you've got your high input monoculture. So you're growing a ton of food and you're growing one type of food. So you got one type of food and you're growing a lot of it. But that one type of food that you're growing has been selected very specifically to grow a lot of that specific thing, grow more with less, with the best features of that type of plant that you can get. You're going to be using a lot of fertilizer. You're going to be using a lot of pesticides, a lot of water. You're also going to have an increased amount of intensity. Basically, you're farming more and more and more in the same amount of space, creating more crops from the same amount of area. So if you look at the Green Revolution, where this kind of began, you're looking at the blue stuff right here. The more industrialized and developed countries, Europe and North America, are going to get it first because they started industrializing first, and they had the means to begin farming using mechanized type stuff, and a lot of the technology that went into this had to be developed, and these places are where it started first. And then you see, after the 1970s, countries like Mexico and China and India, a lot of Asia, actually, if you look at this, began to catch on to the movement because they had their own food problems, and they began to catch up their own on the technology aspect of things. Um, so, an example of something that a specific type of food or crop that came from the Green Revolution, it's golden rice, is what they call it. Grains of hope or an illusion. In a lot of underdeveloped countries or less developed countries, vitamin A deficiencies can actually cause blindness, because a lot of the food they were eating wasn't, it's just whatever they could get their hands on, really. And so golden rice was genetically engineered to contain something called beta carotene, something, and it's basically a vitamin A additive almost. And because these areas already grow rice, you grow golden rice, and you can kind of artificially give people vitamin A and save people from blindness. Um, you know, there's going to be cheaper ways to supply vitamin A other than getting a lot of the smaller farmers, because it's not super industrialized farming in these less developed areas, so they would have to get genetically modified stuff. But there's cheaper ways to get vitamin A. I'm not sure what they are, but apparently there are cheaper ways to supply vitamin A. And beta carotene, whatever, is, you take over-the-counter vitamin supplements, and whether your vitamin C from your orange juice digests or is converted in your body the same way as taking a vitamin C pill, it's the same kind of deal. Here's a man holding some grains, I guess wheat, that's what that is. So that's an interesting picture. In the U.S., since the U.S. is one of the first ones to catch on to the kind of industrialized farming, since 1940, food production in general in the U.S. has doubled crop production, and a total of 9% of the population is involved in the U.S. agricultural system. The agricultural industry is the largest industry based off employment in the U.S. currently, and it generates 18% of our country's gross national product. Animal products, I think, as I mentioned earlier, sorry, actually have significant impacts on the environment and a lot of stuff versus growing, just vegetables and greens and stuff, plants. And as wealth and commerce increased, meat consumption, milk, eggs, animal products, and that began to increase because people could afford it more, and so we grow it more, or cultivate it more, whatever you say. Since the 40s, globally, meat production has increased fivefold. I guess that's the word. So, it doubled 5 times. Well, 5 times its original, not doubled. That's different. And then per capita meat consumption has doubled. So here's a chart here of meat and seafood production per person, so per capita. Obviously, meats that are not seafood have seen an increase, as well as seafood. So the most efficient way to farm animals is, it's not what you see in I don't know what movies have farms in them. Hannah Montana, I think, has a farm in it or something. And, you've got a small family or a large family. Usually agricultural families have a lot of kids. Anyways, someone wakes up in the morning and goes and milks the cows and gets the eggs in a little basket and whatever. That's not It's not how commercial farming is. Feedlot agriculture, factory farms, or concentrated animal feeding operations, CAFOs, are basically massive warehouses um, designed around growing meat and a lot of meat, or growing cows that can be milked and creating a lot of milk, or growing chickens, or cultivating chickens to not grow eggs but create eggs. Um, and half the world's pork and poultry comes from these factory farms. And they do have some benefits. They're very efficient. You can produce a lot of food. And in the U.S., I mean, there's no way you could have small family farms growing chickens and possibly expect to meet the needs of the massive amount of meat consumption um, that happens in the U.S. Um, um, and animals just being on the land themselves, especially a lot of them, contribute to decreasing the quality of land. Cows eat grass, eat all the grass. What are you gonna do? Grow more grass? Whatever. Drawbacks of these factory farms: a lot of water and air pollution goes into it. Cows, especially, they drink a lot of water, and a lot of water goes into cultivating cows. And air pollution, I think the number one, I may be wrong, very top, very, very top producer of methane in the U.S. is agriculture. Cows digest stuff, same as humans, and expel gases, whatever you want to call that. I don't know. But you've got a bunch of animals packed closely together. They obviously poop on the ground, and it's not like you're constantly cleaning it out. It's like your house, so it kind of builds up, and these animals are living in this, and disease spreads, and it's a big problem. And to be able to control that, you have to start using antibiotics, which are used very heavily in the commercial meat industry to help control disease in their animals. Some more facts here. Meat is a very quality source of protein. Once again, between 1950 and 1996, world meat production increased fourfold, so 4 times, and but the per capita meat production rose by 29%, meaning that amount of meat is not being evenly distributed between the world's population. And 14% of U.S. topsoil is associated with livestock grazing. Cattle belch out 12 to 15% of all the methane released into the atmosphere. And estimates, some people say that if Americans can cut their grain intake by 16%, this would save enough grain to provide a subsistence diet for nearly 900 million people. It's a lot of people that can be fed just by a 16% decrease in grain intake. So your breads and your pastas and all that mess. Food problems around the world. You look at this chart here, it's kind of squished, but you see population growth in developing regions. Look at this, increasing by the billions, or by 2050. Total population is going to be in the 10 billion range. I think right now we're like 7.5 or something like that. It's like right here. Well, that's developing regions. Industrialized regions, if you look at growth models for countries, developed regions and industrialized regions that are entering the post-industrial stage tend to have lower population growth, and can even begin to come negative population growth, which is a problem in some areas. But developing regions, the ones with less access to food are having the most amount of increase in the population. Um, and that's one of the big causes for food insecurity, but also increasing affluence, so increasing amount of wealth being concentrated in smaller areas, and then using a lot of that food. My computer sounds like it's about to blow up. And then the degradation of cropland, so farming practices that aren't very good for the environment begin to destroy the environment, and that land can no longer be used for agriculture, so that land is now wasted. Yeah, so back to the affluence problem. You've got people eating. I mean, in America, we waste so much food. It's crazy. And your mom says, "Oh, you're not gonna eat your broccoli." Think about starving kids in Africa or whatever, right? It's a really legitimate problem. Undernourishment. A lot of developing regions, people receive too few calories in a day. Children can be really affected by this. Malnutrition. You can be eating food. You can eat Cheetos all day, and you're not receiving. You might be full, and you might gain 500 pounds in a year, but it's not enough nutrients that your body needs. Your body needs nutrients. You need protein. You need whatever else you need to survive. I don't know. But in these developing countries, not just in developing countries, out of the world population, every 5 seconds, a child starves to death. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Someone just died from, or a child just died from starvation. So, very striking statistic to look at. And then there's overnutrition problem. Obesity is one of the biggest killers in America, and that's overnutrition. So people receiving too many calories in a day. And in the U.S., people eat junk food, and then they don't exercise, and they get a bunch of people. And worldwide, there's 300 million people who are classified as obese. So diseases that can come from malnutrition and undernutrition, anemia. I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce those. Rickets, scurvy. I think that comes from some kind of vitamin deficiency. Famine versus actual food shortages. So political situations can cause famine. So you've got corrupt governments in some places that literally restrict food access to people, or don't have the resources to get food to the people that need it. That would be famine. Darfur region of Sudan, their political situation is I guess not good, and they can't distribute food properly. And then there's food shortages, and that is not on that slide. It's on this slide. And food shortages, like you live in the desert, obviously you can't just walk outside and plant lettuce in the dust or in there or whatever. So that's food shortage. But some good news. Between 1970 and 1995, the proportion worldwide of people suffering from undernourishment shrunk from 36% down to 14%. So obviously, as more food is being created or produced, it is starting to kind of level out among the world population. The number of malnourished people fell from 940 million in 1970 to 850 million in 1995. I think I said this earlier. We produce more than enough food in the world to meet the basic nutritional needs of every person on Earth today. So it's a problem of distribution. So some effects of food production on the environment. You've got your loss of biodiversity, habitat loss. Your fish are being killed in massive numbers. You've got poaching of predators for your more exotic type stuff. and your loss of genetic diversity because of the monocultures that are being produced by genetically modified farming practices and stuff like that. The soil is really taking a hit um, as the nutrients are lost from the soil, and farmers aren't leaving a lot of the leftovers from the plants actually provide a pretty significant amount of nutrition to the ground. So you grow corn, you take the corn off the stalk, you grind the corn down, and over time it'll release itself back into soil versus pulling them all out of the ground and planting something completely different. That it's not that cycle of nutritional or nutrients is not being properly managed. So you're going to lose fertility. You're going to have salination of your soil, so you're constantly leaving behind more and more salt in your ground, I guess. And as the ground becomes more or less nutrient rich, the ground is going to, you ever see the difference between clay and like a really nice loam type material? You put water and loam, you squeeze it out, it's good. Put water and clay, you make pots out of clay. I mean, come on now. Then desertification, basically things just become so dry, it turns to dust like the desert. You got air pollution. So you got your emissions from fossil fuels, and the pollution from pesticide sprays being put into the air because of the mechanization of things and stuff. Water is, once again, the food production and agriculture accounts for the largest use of water in developing countries. You're depleting your aquifers, your underground water masses, I don't know what you call it, pockets. You've got runoff, sedimentation, fish are being killed once again. Pesticides are leaching into your water sources, and over fertilization of lakes from runoff of those fertilizers and stuff going into lakes and creating eutrophication problems and stuff like that. And there's just human health. Nitrates on their own are actually extremely harmful to humans, pretty deadly. Pesticides and disease in drinking water from being run off into water, and then bacterial contamination of meat. USDA, does an extremely good job at making sure that meat has to go through the proper processes to make sure that it's clean and good for human consumption. But no system is perfect. To continue to increase the world crop production, there's a few things that you can do: crossbreeding, and artificial selection. All these things are pretty much going on at the moment. So I think we can probably, there's new foods, the winged bean. You can look at that. It's a crossbreed between a bean and some type of tree seed or something. And I think it actually uses significantly less water, and it grows more on a stalk versus the traditional type of bean that it's used with. I don't exactly know what type it is. Food security, going back to the distribution problems. The definition of food security is the guarantee of adequate, and reliable food supply to all people at all times. So, when you go home, you're going to have a meal, and that. You're sure, because you can afford to do that. And you can actually go to the store and get food, or go somewhere and get food. And, since 1970, hunger is reduced by half. And that's through the use of fossil fuels and irrigation, fertilizers, pesticides, use of more agricultural land, more efficient productive crops and livestock. Definition of monoculture: the uniform planting of a single crop. I don't know if you can see this picture right here, but you basically have that one crop growing in a massive amount of area. Environmental effects of producing food. We just went over that. Interplanting. So instead of monocultures, you can do polyvarietal cultivation. And that's where you've got a plot of land that's planted with different varieties of the same crop. So you're increasing the biodiversity of that crop in the area, leaving it less less susceptible to disease and stuff like that. Intercropping, two or more different crops being grown at the same time. So you might grow corn or soybeans or sweet potatoes and soybeans or something like that. Agroforestry, you've got crops and trees are planted together. So certain crops that don't require as much sunlight or grow completely underground can be planted near trees that have cover. So there's shade, so you can, that that mess that goes on with that. Polyculture, and then the definition of that is many different plants that can mature at different times. So you might be harvesting one thing at a different time and one thing at another time and all that mess. Cultivation of land, 36% of the entire world's land is devoted specifically to growing crops, cultivating food for people to eat. And as that number begins to shrink and the residential and commercial stuff begins to grow, you've got a widening gap of stuff that you need to fill. You need more and more food and less space. In urban areas, people who grow gardens on their roofs and in their backyards and stuff, those account for 15% of the world's food. So it's a pretty good amount. You can start your own garden in your backyard, and you could live more sustainably, growing your own food under your own circumstances, more organically, and using less resources than a commercial farm could. And you save yourself some money. Obviously, you don't have to go buy food from the grocery store. Fishing is the third major food producing system. My audio just cut out for some reason. And fisheries, 99% of the fish caught in the ocean is off the coast and coastal waters. So that's between 1 and 10 miles off of the coast. There's not a lot of deep sea fishing going on. Between 1950 and 1996, the amount of fish being caught increased 4.9 times. Problems with fishing. You think there's a lot of fish in the sea. Not with me, apparently. Anyways, there's overfishing. So, you're taking out so many fish out of the environment that there's not enough left to breed to maintain those numbers. So you have to be careful, and you need to do environmental studies before you go in and start just massively taking fish out of the area. Commercial extinction. So basically you're fishing one species to the point where, it's no longer profitable to even hunt for them because there's so little of them. And then there's, not just going out into the ocean and fishing, there's aquaculture. So you're basically cultivating fish in specific areas. So you can build these little pens in the water, and basically you grow fish and you feed them in there, and they live off the water. And specifically fish farmed in an area, not wild caught, but farmed, supplies 20% of the world's commercial food harvests, and that increased by 3.3 times between 1984 and 1996. Here's an example of a catfish farm. Catfish, there's a bunch of them you see in a big area. I'm sure someone has food and is throwing it off or something. And aquaculture has its own revolution, not the green revolution, but the blue revolution. As wild fish populations are plummeting because people are way overfishing them, and an increased demand for fish, you have to supply the fish. So people came up with aquaculture, raising aquatic organisms for food in a controlled environment, fish farm. They're raised in open water pens or even ponds on land. It is the fastest growing type of food production, and it provides a third of the world's fish, and it's most widespread in Asia. You can see here what type of aquatic animals are grown in fish farms, mostly fish, then your mollusks, clams, and stuff. And then aquatic plants, it's actually a pretty big industry. You can use aquatic plants in, you know, your ponds and stuff to help manage algae and feed your fish. And we have fish in our pond, and we have the right plants in there, they can feed off of that, and we don't ever have to feed them. Benefits and drawbacks: it's a reliable protein source, they're sustainable, they increase food security, they reduce pressure on the wild fish stocks, and it's fairly efficient. Drawbacks: when you got a lot of animals in a small space, diseases can occur, and you have to use antibiotics to reduce that. It reduces food security. Somehow at the same time, I don't know what's up with that. Large amounts of waste are produced when you have fish poop. That's what it is. You can't really just grow grain to feed fish. You have to have a specialized type of food. And these fish that are farmed in these areas that carry different types of diseases, if they escape and release them to the wild, they'll begin to intermingle those diseases and bacteria with other species, and that can become a pretty major problem. Because farming is such a crucial industry, people have to be fed, and they have to get food from somewhere. The government provides, or U.S. government, other governments do, but specifically U.S., provides regulation and stuff and assistance to farmers and consumers to help keep food prices low. So, you can't have wildly increasing prices of food, because then, people will starve because they can't afford food, and you don't want that. So government gives subsidies to farmers to help keep them in business when yields are low or prices are too low or something like that. Is to encourage them to increase their food production, because we need more food. And it's not always economical to produce more food than you're producing, whatever. And they also want to continue to increase the amount of agricultural research, because we need new technology to make sure that we can feed a more amount of people. Sustainable agriculture. It is possible to be sustainable and to feed a ton of people all at one time. It's a method of growing crops and raising livestock based on organic fertilizers, using proper soil conservation measures, water conservation measures, using more biological methods to control pests versus like chemicals, and the minimal use of non-renewable fossil fuels for energy. Components of a more sustainable but low throughput agriculture. You're increasing your high yield polyculture, so growing more than one thing at a time, not just a ton of corn, but a ton of corn and soybeans in the same area. Using more organic fertilizers, more biological pest control, more integrated pest management, so using the environment around you and the current ecosystem and what we know about predators, prey type relationships to use to control pests. Increasing your irrigation and water control measures, putting water where it's needed and not putting water where it's not. You can fly a drone over a farm and figure out exactly which plants need water and fertilizer or whatever. Crop rotation, perennial crops, use of more water efficient crops, so crops that don't require as much water. Usually you can gain that by genetically modifying stuff. Soil conservation measures, decreasing the amount of soil erosion, soil salination, decreasing your aquifer depletion, stopping overgrazing, overfishing, loss of biodiversity, loss of prime cropland food waste, population growth, controlling the population, less people, less food, and decreasing poverty, more evenly, well, not socialist, but, finding ways for the lower end of the people on the lower end of the economic scale to make money and grow their wealth. So that's the end of this PowerPoint. That was food resources, chapter 13, and somehow I just talked for like an hour. There's a little timer up here, right there. Yeah. I don't know how to stop this. How do I stop it? How do I stop it?